The Tom Woods Show, episode 1298.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Men, if you want to dress for success, you want to look smart and well put together, not baggy and clueless. No more off-the-rack suits for you. This week, my listeners can get any premium Indochino made-to-measure suit for just $359 at Indochino.com when entering Woods at checkout. Hi, everybody. Tom Woods here. Of course, you know about the passing of former President George H.W. Bush, so I thought we got to get a quick episode out there, kind of a thumbnail sketch of the Bush presidency in particular and what our assessment of it might be. And joining me to do that is Dan McCarthy, whom we've spoken to a number of times in the past, because Dan has an article in The Spectator on this precise topic, and that's what made me think, all right, Dan's the guy. But Dan, as you'll recall, is editor-at-large of The American Conservative, and he is currently the editor of Modern Age, a venerable conservative quarterly that you can visit at modernagejournal.com. Dan, welcome back.
Thanks, Tom. Glad to be here.
I was wondering what I was going to do with George H.W. Bush, because I thought I've got to talk about him, and I'd like to talk to somebody I, respect about him. And then your column, your Spectator column appeared. So I'll link to that at tomwoods.com/1298. Let's start off. I think I want to focus primarily on his presidency, because you could get really into the weeds on a lot of the other stuff in his life. But what most people are focusing on are the presidential years and his temperament and his, at least publicly, his genial nature. And obviously this is all meant to be an implicit contrast with Trump. I mean, it's like everybody who dies now is going to be an implied contrast with Trump. So let's start with this whole phenomenon of, I suppose when presidents have died, the country has made note of it. But I just, as I think back, when Herbert Hoover died, was there a day of mourning? I don't know how they used to handle it, but it does seem to me like the cult of personality and this kind of response to the passing of these presidents has gotten worse.
Oh, you're absolutely right, it has. I remember my father's astonishment about a decade ago after Gerald Ford died, and you had this sort of week of national mourning for Gerald Ford, of all people. This was a president who was, a national mediocrity, who wound up being a, sort of uneventful figure after Watergate, which was, something to be said, I guess. But Gerald Ford was hardly the sort of person you would expect to have these kind of orgy of, sort of artificial grief on behalf of. And yet, in fact, it did have, this really excessive amount of fawning over the Gerald Ford legacy. And now we're going to get it with George H.W. Bush, not only on account of Bush himself, but as you've mentioned, with the idea of making a contrast between Bush and President Trump, and claiming that everything people don't like about Donald Trump is somehow reversed and sort of great and honorable about George H.W., when in fact, George H.W.'s record as president was absolutely disastrous, and was something that I would think people across the political spectrum would look at and say, man, this was one of the worst presidents we've had, in the latter half of the 20th century.
So let's say something about that. One thing that struck me in your column, I had suspected this was true, but I hadn't really known for sure, was that when, former Vice President Bush became President Bush, he cleaned house, got rid of Reagan appointees, and as you put it in your column, the criterion was, did you support me over Reagan in the primary contest of 1980?
George H.W. Bush had a reputation for being very vicious towards conservatives. And you saw this on the campaign trail in 1980 when he, mocked Reagan's ideas for tax cutting and reducing government as voodoo economics. And then when George H.W. Bush became president after the 1988 election, he basically cleaned house. And he said, anyone in the Reagan administration who had supported Reagan in 1980 over himself was not going to be welcomed into the George H.W. Bush administration. So it was really quite an ideological sweep designed to get rid of Reagan loyalists and to get rid of people who were more philosophically conservative, and to have, sort of personal loyalists to Bush put in office instead. And, one of the things people always claim about Donald Trump is this idea that supposedly he values, personal loyalty over service to the Republican Party or principle or whatever. But that was, very much true in spades with George H.W. Bush, who was all about, whether people had supported him and not whether they had been sort of good staffers in the Reagan administration.
Now, in terms of domestic policy, of course, there are going to be some things that libertarians might object to, but that I think the general public more or less would support, like the Americans with Disabilities Act or the Civil Rights Act, things of that nature. The major domestic thing I think most people remember is that he went back on his pledge not to raise taxes. But even there, I think a lot of the mainstream people would say, well, that just shows how responsible he was, that he was willing to take a political risk and this and that. So domestically, how can you make the case that this was just a disaster and everybody on either side should agree he was terrible?
It was the point in time where questions about American competitiveness in the world had first become really extremely pressing. And you saw this in the 1992 campaign, where both Pat Buchanan challenging George H.W. Bush in the Republican primaries, and then Ross Perot running as a independent candidate in the 1992 election. Both of them challenged George H.W. Bush's record on jobs. And it was clear that America was facing some rather serious competitive difficulties at the time, in particular with the Japanese being extremely successful in terms of sort of replacing American industry with their own industry. So George H.W. Bush, he had had a recession which ended sometime in 1991 officially, but nonetheless carried over with a sort of feeling of national malaise into 1992. His administration was just known for American industry falling behind and for the economy being rather lackluster and Americans losing a lot of hope and winding up not only having some doubts about George H.W. Bush in the Republican primaries and looking at, a wild card candidate like Ross Perot in the general election, but then, of course, ultimately choosing Bill Clinton, who ran as a populist, against George H.W. Bush that November.
Well, now, why don't we turn to foreign policy? Because I think here is where a lot of people give him high marks. They say he presided over the dissolution of the Soviet Union in a mature way and this and that. Then they'll also point to the international coalition that he brought together that culminated in the first Persian Gulf War. And in fact, maybe that's really where we ought to speak, because I recall in those days, I was a freshman in college, and I remember reading Pat Buchanan saying, this is a terrible idea, we shouldn't be waging this war. And Dan, I could not understand for the life of me why Pat was not on board. I could not understand that. I was fully on board because that's what you do in these situations. And it ended up being very swift, and it was over in, not very many days. And at one point, Bush's approval rating shot up to somewhere around 91%, almost unheard of levels. Then, of course, he went on to lose re-election. What can you say about that conflict?
Well, first of all, the ironic thing is George H.W. Bush and his administration almost, in some ways, are responsible for Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in the first place. About 1 week before Saddam Hussein seized Kuwait, Saddam Hussein himself and his foreign minister Tariq Aziz had a meeting with George H.W. Bush's ambassador to Iraq. And it's kind of funny to think, but at the time in 1990, Iraq was not yet a pariah state. It was obviously a state that the U.S. had many reservations about, but we had formal diplomatic relations with them. We had an ambassador, and her name was April Glaspie. She met with Saddam Hussein and Tariq Aziz, and she was asked what the United States would do about the fact that Kuwait and Iraq had this border dispute, and that there was a possibility of unpleasantness developing as a result of this border dispute. And April Glaspie basically led Saddam Hussein to believe, and there are various iterations of exactly what she said, but it seems pretty clear that she said something along these lines. She told him that basically the border dispute was nothing, no part of the United States' business, and that the U.S. was not going to, sort of pick sides or get involved in a dispute between Arabs. Well, Saddam Hussein seems to have taken that as a green light to go ahead and invade Kuwait without having to worry about consequences from the United States. So it's ironic because, George W. Bush wound up being a president who was quite willing to use force. He used it in Panama. He used it in Iraq. And in fact, he was the one who, inserted troops into Somalia at the end of his administration as well, which turned out to be a terrible disaster a few months later. But ironically enough, I mean, if Bush had been tougher and clearer right there in the summer of 1990, he might actually have deterred Saddam Hussein simply by telling him, look, yes, the United States would take it as an act of aggression that the United States would want to police if you go ahead and annex Kuwait or do anything sort of aggressive towards this little state. So, one of the ironies here is that George W. Bush bears a certain measure of responsibility for the fact that the war occurred in the first place. And then the war itself, yes, it was over very quickly. It was a kind of splendid military victory in a few days' time, and wound up sort of remoralizing America, restoring morale after the sort of long years hangover after the Vietnam War. But the long-term repercussions of our Persian Gulf War wound up being very troubling. George H.W. Bush seemed to have thought that there would be some uprising against Saddam Hussein in Iraq itself as a result of Hussein losing the Persian Gulf War. Once again, there were people who, so-called swamp Arabs, tribal groups in Iraq, who took encouragement from George H.W. Bush and did in fact rise up against Saddam Hussein, but there was no support for them, and so they wound up being slaughtered by Saddam Hussein. So on the one hand, George H.W. Bush was again sending mixed signals that got people killed. And on the other hand, he wound up, imposing a no-fly zone over Iraq and just basically creating a sort of prolonged and festering situation after what had appeared to be a splendid victory. I mean, he couldn't let go of the sort of Iraq situation even after Kuwait had been freed from Saddam Hussein's clutches. So really, I mean, what appeared to be a splendid victory at the time wound up being something that got us deeper and deeper into Mideast politics and would have enormous consequences over the next decade and beyond.
I've been reading some commentary because it's been so long since that war. I haven't given it much thought since then, but I'm remembering some of the details now about the way it was waged, and there are a lot of complaints that the civilian infrastructure was destroyed and that people arguing this could not have been by accident, and hospitals leveled and shelters and part of the warp and woof of civilian life. So this is not, we were given the impression that it was incredibly surgical because we had these super precise weapons and things of that nature. And then when you went and looked, it turned out to be much more gruesome. But then I also remember, again, I was a college kid at the time, I don't remember actually when the operation against Noriega was. Maybe I wasn't in college yet. Maybe that was 89. I don't remember the exact year. But when he went after Manuel Noriega in Panama, okay, even there were neighborhoods that were leveled, a lot of civilians killed, several thousand, I think. And it's not really, I mean, to this day, was anybody threatened by Panama? I mean, I can't even remember what the rationale for that was.
Yeah, I think that war was a sort of outgrowth of the war on drugs. Basically, George H.W. Bush set the precedence for this idea of the United States as the world's policeman and global cop after the end of the Cold War. You saw that in Panama. You saw that to a much greater extent in the first Gulf War. And then again, you had this ultimately, disastrous and nationally humiliating intervention in Somalia, which got started at the very end of George H.W.'s term in office. In fact, George H.W. Bush had already lost the 1992 election when he decided it was time to send U.S. peacekeepers into basically what was a civil war in Somalia. So the whole, interventionist 1990s, the whole course of U.S. foreign policy in the 1990s and then into the post 9/11 era with his son, all of that was set by the precedents George H.W. Bush established at a time when Americans really should have been enjoying a peace dividend at the end of the Cold War, not just in terms of our finances, not just in terms of not having to spend as much, having to, sort of compete with the Soviet Union, which of course wasn't really in much of a condition to compete anyway at the end of the Cold War there, but rather we should have enjoyed a peace dividend in terms of having actual peace and having fewer wars and having the ability to come home and play less of a sort of interventionist role in the world and becoming a normal country again, as Gene Kirkpatrick had said. And instead, we did exactly the opposite. We expanded our ambitions around the world rather than adopting a more modest and small R Republican sort of strategy. And that was entirely on George H.W. Bush. He was someone who really, after the end of the Cold War, decided on a different and even more grandiose American project.
Dan, I'm going to lighten the conversation for just a minute with a sponsored message. Some people know about my personal crusade against the untucked shirt. It's the worst trend of the past 500 years, but it's me against the world on that one. One thing you've got to agree with me on, though, is that every man looks better and feels more confident when he puts on a suit. So if you're going to go to all that trouble, that suit better fit you just right. How many libertarians do we run into wearing these baggy suits, and it's just embarrassing? There's no longer any excuse for that, especially when made-to-measure suits are available at such great prices. So that's why I recommend Indochino, North America's leading made-to-measure menswear company. Now, I'm very conservative, but you'll find a wide selection of high-quality fabrics and colors to choose from, and the option to personalize the details, including your lapel, lining, pockets, buttons, and writing your own monogram. And the process, whether in person or online, couldn't be easier. This week, my listeners can get any premium Indochino suit for just $359 at Indochino.com when entering Woods at checkout. That's 50% off the regular price for a made-to-measure premium suit. Plus, shipping is free. That's Indochino.com, promo code WOODS, for any premium suit for just $359 and free shipping. That's an incredible deal for a premium made-to-measure suit. Now, initially, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the military budget does go down a bit. But this seems to be only a blip if you look at the overall trend. And now it's just, it's like we've got 10 Soviet Unions that we're facing. But initially there was that blip. But you know from Bush's outlook on the world, there's no way that they weren't going to find some type of new mission to undertake. Now, he apparently, in his old age, he says he voted for Hillary over Trump, didn't he?
You know, I forget whether, I think you're right. He did say he actually voted for Hillary over Trump. It's the whole Bush family was, putting out various vague comments about the election throughout the 2016 season. But I think you're exactly right. I think eventually he did come right out and say that he voted for Clinton. He certainly implied it.
Yeah, well, I'm reading on the BBC. Well, see, now we're saying, okay, George W. Bush didn't vote for Trump or Clinton, but George Bush Sr. calls Trump a blowhard and voted for Clinton, is what we read on the BBC. So at the very least, we have a story that went out with that, as far as I can see, without a correction. So I can't get completely inside the head of that man, but I think even though he did wage a tough fight against Bill Clinton in 92, I think he was basically sincere in being friendly with his successors after that. And I think he does feel more at home with Hillary than with Trump. And I wonder if that in general is worthy of comment.
Well, I think it is. Donald Trump is, in many respects, the anti-Bush, whether we're talking about George H.W. Bush or George W. And I think that's significant. Basically, Donald Trump, who was already, sort of certainly politically aware in 1989 and was very much, thinking about the crime wave that the country was seeing in 1989. That was the height of the crack epidemic. And who was also thinking about things like the U.S. Trade battle with Japan. Donald Trump was in part formed politically by the experience of the George H.W. Bush years. And he saw those years as being, again, a kind of national humiliation and a defeat and a movement in the wrong direction, even despite the apparent success of the first Persian Gulf War there. So Donald Trump, quite naturally, I think, is seen as being something of a counterpoint to George H.W. Bush. And the problem is that many pundits are going out there and claiming that George H.W. Bush was the success story, was the sort of dignified adult, and Donald J. Trump is the sort of antithesis of everything that's meant to be presidential. But in fact, it was the failures of George H.W. Bush which have given rise to the need for someone like Donald Trump in the first place, that he is the correction to the sort of false path that George H.W. Bush and then, of course, his son set the entire country upon.
Well, as I say, we're focusing today on his presidential years, so I wouldn't talk so much about the vice presidential stuff just to keep this narrowly focused. But still, when he was president, he carried out some pardons of people involved in the Iran-Contra affair, which had occurred while he was vice president. Do you have an opinion on the Iran-Contra affair and on the pardons?
Well, the Iran-Contra thing is quite a big mess. Arms for hostages, question of how much awareness Ronald Reagan had about it. And certainly there were a lot of cowboys in the Reagan administration who were doing things that went beyond the president's approval. So, I don't want to get too deeply into the ins and outs of it. In general, I think, these sorts of pardons after a scandal are to be expected. You saw them with Bill Clinton at the end of his administration, pardoning a variety of whitewater figures and others. So I just find it hard to get worked up about these things. They are pretty much predictable. Of course, the sort of archetype for the whole thing was Gerald Ford's pardon of Nixon. And that pardon, I would say, actually was important and did serve a good purpose. Whether these other pardons of Iran-Contra figures and later, figures involved in other scandals under other presidents, that's a different question. Certainly one of the things that George H.W. Bush accomplished issuing these pardons, however, was to partially rehabilitate certain neoconservative figures. Admiral Poindexter, who was one of the pardonees, I believe, returns during the George W. Bush years and is someone who is almost put in charge or briefly put in charge of a program called Total Information Awareness. You have a number of other rather dubious figures who wind up being pardoned by George H.W. Bush so that they can come back in various ways in later administrations and do harm. So in that sense, quite apart from Iran-Contra itself, it was troubling to have some of these figures rehabilitated.
We might also point out, because it'd be impossible on a libertarian podcast not to say something about the war on drugs, that September 5th, 1989, that's the day of the first televised national address Bush gives. He says that drugs are the greatest domestic threat facing our nation today, and he approved, among a number of other things, a program that basically initiated what we've started to see picking up steam in recent years, which is equipping local police departments and state police departments with military-grade equipment in order to carry out drug raids. So we have that, and even there, if we just want to be pure utilitarians, the results have not been impressive in terms of drug use, obviously. But Nixon also has a hand in that. They all have a hand in that. But there's another thing that I'm going to give a speech, and we're going to crack some more skulls, and then we'll see what happens. And it doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah, Bush wound up escalating pretty much any bad policy you can think of in the federal government, whether it's raising taxes, whether it's putting an undue burden on businesses through the Americans with Disabilities Act, whether it's escalating the drug war, or whether it's, at the end of the Cold War, instead of coming home, increasing our involvement in various conflicts and sort of morasses all around the world. George H.W. Bush was a very strong statist. He was an interventionist on just about every level, and the country has paid a terrible price for that.
All right, Dan, I'm going to let you run. I know we're tight on time today, but I did want to get at least a thumbnail sketch George W. Bush, or H.W. Bush, I beg your pardon, episode out there. And then this week I'm also talking to David Stockman by pure coincidence. And so when I have him on, I would be very interested in his views of George H.W. Bush, because they obviously knew each other, with Stockman being in the Reagan White House and then having been in the U.S. Congress before that. So I think I'll get some interesting perspective on that also. But tell me what's going on these days with Modern Age, which is a journal more people need to know about. It's been around for, I guess, over 60 years now?
That's correct. So, a lot of my sort of casual week-to-week writing can be found in the spectator.us, which is an American website that's been launched by the British publication The Spectator. And again, its URL is spectator.us. But my sort of most long-form and thoughtful writing, and also the journal I edit, is to be found in Modern Age, which was a publication founded by Russell Kirk back in the 1950s. And today you can get it in print, and you can also get it online at modernagejournal.com. And right now we actually have a sale going on where you can subscribe to the journal for 2 full years, which gives you print and digital copies of the journal for only $27. So I really highly recommend, as a Christmas gift, whether for listeners themselves or for their friends, subscribing to Modern Age, while this offer is good. So for just $27, you can get 2 years of the journal, both print and web. And you can visit the website, www.modernagejournal.com, and have a sampling of our articles, and in fact see my latest long-form essay there on the Clash of Civilizations, Samuel Huntington's thesis from 25 years ago, and sort of paying tribute to the great Samuel Huntington 10 years after his death.
All right, that all sounds very interesting. I'm certainly going to check out that article of yours. And as I've said, your column on George H.W. Bush in The Spectator, I'll link to on the show notes page, tomwoods.com/1298. All right, I'll let you run, Dan. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks, Tom.
All right, folks, that'll do it. Now, tomorrow, David Stockman joins me, and he will certainly have some things to say also about George H.W. Bush, because Stockman served in the Reagan-Bush administration as a budget director for several years. So we'll definitely get his insights and anecdotes about George H.W. Bush and what his assessment of the man is. And then beyond that, we're going to obviously be talking some economics. So you'll definitely not want to miss that. So make sure you have subscribed to the show over at iTunes. It warms my heart when people subscribe over at iTunes. And it's very easy to do that. It's just tomwoods.com/iTunes. Also, I'm cooking up another free ebook for you. And I want to make sure first that you have one of the recent ones that I put out, because it's a great example of how much information is packed into these. You could read 500-page books and half of it's fluff or detail you don't need. This is just, boom, all the information you need to be really knowledgeable on a topic and to be able to hold your own in a debate with anybody. So the one I recommend right now is my ebook, The Deregulation Boogeyman. Oh, deregulation caused all kinds of problems for us and gave us the financial crisis of 2008. You hear that over and over and over. You got to have an answer for that. Well, man, are you going to have answers for that, and you won't have to go through 800 pages looking for them, because I've narrowed it all down. I've slimmed it down to the absolute knowledge that you need, and it's going to be knowledge that none of your friends have. They haven't been exposed to it, because they hear only one perspective all the time. So how do you get that ebook? You go to regulationmyths.com and you get it right there. Regulationmyths.com is where you go. All right, David Stockman tomorrow, everybody. See you soon.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.